So as Anita already introduced, what I'm going to talk about briefly today are the recommendations and findings of a study which was carried out by swisspeace, funded by the Swiss federal government, entitled Archives and the Records of Truth Commissions. This study was organised and undertaken by myself and my colleague Sandra Rubli, who will join us on the panel for the question session afterwards. So maybe it would help to just very briefly say something about the scope of the study before moving on to the recommendations. So the purpose of the study was to update the 2005 work, which has already been mentioned, by Trudy Huskamp-Peterson, called Final Acts, A Guide to Preserving the Records of Truth Commissions, in which she detailed what had happened to the archives of Truth Commissions which had completed their mandate prior to 2005. So what we did is we followed up on the cases included in this study to see where there was new information available, and we also looked into the cases where the Truth Commissions had completed their mandate after 2005 and up to the end of our study, which was in spring 2013, so we don't unfortunately include the case study of Kenya in this. The two main outputs from this project, which will be available to everyone, are of course the guidance note, which has been mentioned, which is here on the table, and also detailed case study descriptions. These are almost ready for publication and will be available on our website, but you can of course contact us if you're interested in this work, because obviously we can't necessarily discuss all of the details today. So then on to the main findings and recommendations. I'll just focus on four key areas. Firstly, on the planning of archives of Truth Commissions. Secondly, say something briefly about the sensitivity of the information, then on access, and then on the further use of Truth Commission archives. So, and this echoes very much what we've already heard on the panel. In terms of archival planning, we found that practice really varied from cases where the archives of Truth Commissions, what would happen to them was planned even before the Truth Commission starts their work. For example, in the case of Timor-Leste, and also in the case of South Africa, where you have planning for the archives that happened during the mandate of the Truth Commission as included in their final recommendations, and then some cases where the Truth Commission is completely silent on the issue. Having said that, I think we could say that broadly there's a trend to increasingly engaging with the question of archives by Truth Commissions in their work and by dealing with the past observers and experts. So in this issue, what would we recommend? Well, firstly, that the planning of the archives and the management of records should take place in advance of the creation and collection of the first materials. Very often this isn't the case and leads to later complications. Ideally, decisions on the records management and who's responsible should already be included, therefore, in the law establishing the mandate of the Truth Commission, taking into account, where possible, existing information laws and privacy acts. We've already heard from the Special Rapporteur this isn't always possible, but where it is possible, this should happen. And we believe it's very important to include archivists in this process to use already existing expertise from the work of archivists, both within transitional justice processes and archivists who work outside of those processes but have still established good practice. We also believe that when planning a custodian, a repository for the records, it is also obviously very important that they're a trusted custodian as outlined by the Special Rapporteur, but also that to think about the symbolic value of the location which is chosen. So for example, we've already heard about the Peace Museum in Sierra Leone. In Timor-Leste, the archives are in the former prison, the site of the former prison. So what relevance will this have symbolically for issues around access, for example, and how the archives may be used by people? Then on the second issue, the sensitivity of the information, and there are obviously broad issues around safety, integrity of the material, which we've already heard from each of the other panelists. And very briefly, we would say that it's always obviously a balance between privacy, confidentiality and access, but there should be very well established guidelines for handling sensitive information, in many of the case studies we looked at, it was surprising how limited the expertise of people working on the Truth Commission archives was around issues of dealing with sensitive information. So clear guidelines accessible for people working with commissions would be very important. Thirdly, then, the question of access, which is obviously connected to the issue of sensitive information. We would say that we found in our study that the question of access was particularly difficult, and here we saw a very large gap between statements of access and access in practice. Quite often, decisions around access to Truth Commission archives were very much made on a case-by-case basis, quite often by individuals who did not have any archival training, and would therefore the practice and the access in reality would often be quite different to the access policy outlined even in the original Truth Commission mandate and law. So we would say that it's very important to have clearly stated access policies and best practice which can be shared across Truth Commissions. And ideally, the competency for this would be located within the Truth Commission archives itself, so that people who are experienced with and involved in daily issues of the archives and are familiar with practices around managing records of a particularly sensitive nature, they would have the competency and the responsibility for developing that access policy. The last main area we looked at, which was the future use of Truth Commission archives. I mean, we've already heard how important they are in issues around prosecution, for example, reparation programs, and, for example, commemorations also as well, and memory building exercises within countries. We've got, again, in the case study description, there are lots of details about how this has happened, how the archives can be linked to a much more holistic approach to dealing with the past and transitional justice. For example, the case study of Peru, where the archival documentation has been used to develop 2 school textbooks, one of which is distributed widely in every public school, one of which is now no longer distributed because of the very political sensitive issues around the type of narrative which is taken out of the Truth Commission archives and distributed in the schools. This might be something we'd be interested to talk about as a group. In terms of recommendations here, we would say that we should think about not only having archives located in capital cities, in urban centres, but also perhaps copies of the archives located in regional centres which are more accessible and available for outreach. And here the digitisation of material is also very important, it's already been mentioned. But also developing materials based on the archives which are more accessible for people perhaps with less formal education, illiterate people, for example. Here we might think about the cartoons that have been developed in the case of Sierra Leone, and maybe also other formats like radio programmes to allow the archives to not only be accessible but also to undertake outreach work which will increase the transparency issues around Truth Commission work and perhaps, and hopefully, the legitimacy of that very important work around the right to truth. So just in summary then, I would say that we've seen in our study that there's some very good practice in terms of planning for archives of Truth Commissions, handling the sensitive information, and using the archives in broader processes relevant for transitional justice. But the practice is very varied, and we need sets of clear guidelines that can be used by archivists and also dealing with the past practitioners together working on Truth Commissions. In particular, we see that there's a lot of funding now for Truth Commissions in some cases, but we think it's also important that some of this should be specifically dedicated to the archives work of the Truth Commissions, so that it's not an afterthought at the end of their work. And we intend to obviously continue our work. The study's finished, but we're looking for new opportunities to continue research and practice, and we're very open and hopeful that today is an opportunity to extend our network and collaboration on this issue.